Tonight marks the start of the 5th Democracy Exchange. We're a collaboration between OCAD University, the dais at Toronto Metropolitan University, and Open Democracy Project. The theme this year is Courage Through Chaos, and our goal is to connect and equip people who are taking action to strengthen democracy and civil society. The summit runs until Saturday, and as Gregory said, there's some amazing programming, and you can learn more about how to join us, if you'd like, at DemocracyXChange.org. I want to thank the Toronto Public Library for being such outstanding partners since the first Democracy Exchange Summit in 2017. We're so excited, we're so thankful for that partnership, and we're so excited for tonight's discussion. So on that note, I will pass the microphone to Angela Pacienza, who's the executive editor of the Globe and Mail and the CJF programming co-chair, who's going to introduce our guests.
Hey everyone, thank you for braving the rain. On behalf of the CJF, it is my pleasure to welcome you to tonight's conversation featuring two bright lights of journalism, Katie Drummond, Global Editorial Director of Wired, and Anita Li, Founder, Editor, and CEO of The Green Line. At the CJF, we have a saying, as journalism goes, so goes democracy. We know that our democracy depends on access to reliable sources of news and information to allow our citizens to make decisions about the issues that impact their lives. And that's why we're thrilled to partner with the Toronto Public Library once again and join on the On Civil Society series of conversations featuring leading experts and thinkers from all over the world on the most critical topics of our time. I want to tell you about two upcoming CJF events that continue on the theme of media and democracy. On May 7th, in partnership with Massey College, we'll be hosting a conversation between Marty Barron, the former editor of the Washington Post, and Elizabeth Renzetti, a former columnist at the Globe and Mail, about Barron's latest book, Collision of Power, Trump, Bezos, and the Washington Post. And on May 22nd, we'll be back here in partnership with the Toronto Public Library with Ben Smith, editor of Semaphore and author of Traffic, Genius, Rivalry, and Delusion in the billion-dollar race to go viral. He'll be on stage with Elamine Abdel Mahmoud, host of CBC's Commotion and fellow CJF board member. You can get more information on the CJF website or the Toronto Public Library for tickets. Now, onto our event for tonight. For over 30 years, Wired has been exploring the ways in which science and technology are reshaping the world and humanity. The publication has maintained its position as the voice of digital culture in the rapidly changing media landscape, where, in the words of Condé Nast Chief Content Officer and Global Editor of Vogue, Anna Wintour, who I've always wanted to quote, the worlds of technology and culture are shifting and colliding every single day. I should have worn my sunglasses. Katie Drummond is the dynamic force serving as the Global Editorial Director of Wired. She came to Wired just last year, having run Vice's digital reporting, video, and audience development teams as Vice expanded its journalism across Latin America, Europe, and Asia. She's held leadership roles at Gizmodo, Bloomberg, and Verge, among others. It's fair to say that she has spent her career at the cutting edge of journalism and innovation and digital storytelling. And a fun fact for everyone, she is a fellow Canadian who grew up in Calgary. Joining Katie tonight is Anita Li, the visionary founder and CEO of The Green Line, an award-winning hyper-local news outlet that reaches young and other underserved Torontonians and hosts conversations about the issues that touch their lives. Anita has emerged as a true trailblazer in Canadian media. I know we're all eager to hear what they have to say. It's an honor to have you both with us tonight. So Anita, over to you.
Everyone here, you're in for a real treat. We're going to dive into the mind behind Wired, somebody who's really has her finger on the pulse of the future of digital news. So I'm very excited for you all. And I'm going to try to do justice to this very wide-ranging topic in the 45 minutes we have because there's a lot of ground to cover. So let's get straight to it.
Let's do it.
So Katie, there's over 60 million readers across all of Wired's properties on 4 continents. And you're relatively new in your role. You've been global editorial director for 7 months. And you're starting your tenure during a really critical time in global politics, particularly where you're based in the US, because obviously there's a major presidential election coming up this year. And last month you released a memo talking about Wired's approach to covering the US presidential election. And you said that you're viewing politics through a tech lens. So I'm really curious to hear what you mean by this exactly and your thinking behind this strategy.
Sure, yes. We do have a bit of an election coming up in November in the United States where I live, which you can all observe from a safe distance here in Toronto, lucky you. But it actually, Wired has a legacy sort of ebbing and flowing of getting into politics coverage and then sort of pulling back from politics coverage and getting into it and pulling back. And when I showed up, I started my job on August 28th. And I woke up on August 29th at like 4:30 in the morning because I was very anxious, having just started my new job. And I said to myself, oh no, I need to build a politics team. Like, I need to do this. I mean, Wired has, tremendous journalists across technology, business, consumer tech, science, internet culture, but we did not have a politics team. And so I sent to my boss, Anna Wintour, an email that morning outlining sort of, this is what we need to do, and I need to do it like now. And not only because we were facing down, a monumental election year in the United States in 2024, this was late 2023 that I sent this anxious memo to her. This is a historic election year around the world. There are, I think, more national level elections this year than there have been in sort of decades and decades of history. In Mexico, Russia will have an election. In Ukraine, India obviously is sort of, there's a massive election coming up there this spring. And so it felt to me, I think, sort of the tagline for our politics. So I sent her this memo and she wrote back and said, I love it. How many open headcount do you have? And I said, none. I need you to give some to me. And then she did. And so I was able to build this politics team. And we were able to hire some fantastic journalists who are based in the United States and in Europe to cover politics in the Wired way. And, this felt really important to me when you think about how sort of specifically mediated politics is now by technology, right? So if you think about, a candidate's presidential campaign and how important it is for them to show up, not just sort of on broadcast television, but on Twitter, on Facebook, on TikTok, which is, where the Biden campaign launched a month ago. So sort of the campaign piece of it is obviously very sort of intricately interwoven with technology, but so much of the discourse around politics and sort of the outcomes of our elections are now mediated by and sort of inextricably linked to technology and the conversations that people are having in digital spaces. I mean, if you look at January 6, 2020, very memorable day for all of us, I'm sure, even in Canada, those were conversations that started from mis and disinformation that was, proliferating across the internet from, Telegram to Discord to these, various forums to Donald Trump's Twitter account. That's where that started. And then it metastasized out into the physical world. And so you can't cover the future the way Wired needs to, right? We exist in service of a better future. And in order to cover that, we need to cover decisions that are happening in the political realm, particularly as they pertain to technology. So we've hired fantastic reporters. One, McKenna Kelly, who came to us from The Verge, and she's really covering sort of online campaigning and sort of the online candidate. What does it mean to be a candidate for office in the year 2024? How does that manifest itself on the internet? We have a reporter, David Gilbert, who's actually based in Ireland in a very remote, undisclosed location, because he covers online extremism and the far right. And so he has really been covering sort of how these communities are percolating and what they're talking about and what they're doing. And even this week, he was reporting on, election denial groups in the United States, which, effectively shockingly large groups of people who think that the 2020 election was stolen and that already the 2024 election is on track to be disrupted. And they are already holding webinars and convening in online forums and even developing tools to compare voter registration tallies with postal service data about people's names and addresses to be able to allege that, the vote in this state, in this county, in this district was stolen and that this vote was incorrect. So he's really focused on that. And then, of course, we can't talk about anything right now, really, but including politics, without talking about artificial intelligence. And so we're very focused on sort of how generative AI and these tools that have been developed very, very quickly, they sort of just exploded in the last year and a half with OpenAI, how they have the potential to be used and abused in terms of just sort of sowing chaos in an election cycle. I mean, in New Hampshire a few months ago, there was a perfect example of how this can manifest, right? With an artificially intelligent robocall that was calling people, telling them not to vote for Biden in the primary, to save their vote because they only get one vote, and to not go to the polls and to not vote for Biden in the Democratic primary. That was, made using generative AI technology developed by a very mainstream, VC-funded startup out of Silicon Valley that was sort of weaponized to try to create chaos. That was a very long answer to your question, but it's obviously something that I feel very strongly about. I think that this is, in my lifetime, I'm in my late 30s, it's hard, I cannot think of an election that has been of greater consequence in the United States. And I really hope to never live through one again. I hope that this is the last time I have to live through something like this, but I feel, a journalistic responsibility to cover it, and given where I work and what we cover, I think we are very well positioned to do that coverage in a really smart way with a lot of expertise around how this technology is actually shaping this election.
I think you set the stage beautifully for the rest of our conversation. And we definitely will be getting into AI in depth later on. I wanted you, because in our pre-conversation, you mentioned something really fascinating about how the Biden campaign is actually giving greater media access to influencers over traditional media. So can you tease a bit of some of the stories that are going to be coming out of Wired in the next little while?
Yeah, this was really interesting to us. So McKenna, and these campaigns, the Biden campaign, among them is, they're becoming very savvy about how audiences consume information, who they trust, who they listen to, and who they don't. And I think there is a real recognition among political campaigns and even among the media, right, that audiences, particularly younger audiences or voting demographics, are less inclined to go to a news outlet or even the president or a presidential candidate than they are their favorite person on TikTok, right? And so the Biden campaign has, I think, very strategically been tapping digital influencers on the shoulder and saying, we'd love for you to get the message of our campaign out to your audience on these platforms where you have a big sort of organic audience. And McKenna, our reporter, went to an event in New York a few weeks ago. It was a big event. Biden, Obama, and Clinton were there. So the convening of these sort of three presidents, and all of the press was sort of shuttled off into like a press room, and the influencers who were invited were given sort of just wonderful treatment by the Biden campaign. They were invited to go along with the president to his various, doopa-doopa-doo, and she was sort of sitting in the press room being like, wait a second, I thought that was my job. And so she wrote a little bit about it, but we're gonna be looking at that and sort of how these influencers are being sort of utilized by various campaigns. I think RFK is a really interesting person to be watching in the US election right now. I mean, he is, I think, the most popular sort of independent candidate to run for federal office in the US since Ross Perot, which I think I was like little bitty baby when Ross Perot was on the scene. So been a long time, but he is very much like, he is an online candidate, and he has really sort of tapped that influencer network to get his, very conspiratorial, very inaccurate, very disingenuous messaging out to an electorate. And he himself is sort of playing this very interesting role as online influencer. His TikTok account has, multi-million views on these videos that he's putting out, because he has really, I think, taken the influencer playbook and applied it to himself as candidate, which is really, really interesting to watch, stressful to watch, but very interesting to cover.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And just this notion of how with journalism outlets, obviously, as you know, at Wired, we adhere to a set of standards and principles and values, whereas if we're kind of leaving it to influencers, what does that say about the nature of the information that gets disseminated? And this notion of, obviously, this is an event in partnership with DemocracyXChange. We have to have a shared understanding of reality to have a strong democracy. So there's something really interesting about
sure,
that.
and the way these platforms work, I mean, I'm a TikTok user. I am actually an avid TikTok user. It's a little bit unhealthy, but my feed, like I exist in my own little TikTok world that the algorithm has discerned. This is what Katie's interested in. This is what we're going to feed her. This is what she is from 8 to 9 p.m. most nights. This is what her experience will be, because that's where you will find me. My husband is here and he knows. I'm on the couch. It's a sad scene. But, when you think about that in the context of politics and the information or mis and disinformation or complete lack of information that someone might get because of how these algorithms actually work, they are designed to give you things that you will like so that you will spend more time there. And so I think the idea that instead of, factual information provided by a news organization with journalists who are trained to report and sort of analyze and then disseminate that information, you're getting, whatever your TikTok algorithm thinks is going to be really interesting to you. And if that happens to be RFK talking about vaccines, you're just going to get more and more and more of that.
And you mentioned that this is obviously an unprecedented time to be covering politics or any sort of issue these days. And you've worked at Vice, Bloomberg, Gizmodo. What did you bring from those experiences to your current role from both editorial and business standpoints? Because as we know, this is a time and era when media industries worldwide are struggling financially.
Yeah, I think editorially, I think of a few things. I think that I have gravitated towards news organizations that have a streak of fearlessness in them. I think that you need it to sort of exist and to do the coverage that is really, really important. You need to be fearless. Gawker Media, whatever you thought of the coverage they did it fearlessly. They did it without fear or favor. Same with Vice, whatever you thought of that coverage, we went places that other journalists did not go. We did it carefully, we did it thoughtfully, we did it intelligently, but we did it. We sort of went where we needed to go, we said what needed to be said, and I think the execution on that, is something I'm really, really proud of. I think, when you look at my resume, I can't help but notice that most of the news organizations that I have worked for no longer exist, right? So, Gawker Media was acquired out of bankruptcy after it was sued into oblivion by Peter Thiel. I was there through that period. Those websites are now being sold off piecemeal by a private equity firm that acquired them. They are, shells of their former selves. They are not doing the kind of journalism that I think Gawker was once known for. Obviously, if you think about Vice, it is hard for me still to talk about without feeling emotional, because it was, a very troubled company at a financial level. The journalism is something that will be very, very hard, if not impossible, to replace in this media ecosystem. And so those experiences, and seeing sort of how fragile this industry is and sort of how quickly journalism that audiences come to love and trust and know can disappear. The journalism that Vice journalists did, hundreds of them around the world, in Asia, across Europe, in Latin America, all across the United States, in Canada, it just doesn't exist anymore. It has disappeared. So it has given me, I think, a real, a real resoluteness and sort of an obstinate stubbornness to make the business of journalism work. And I came into Wired feeling very strongly about that we need to figure out what is a business model for this specific publication that will allow me to sustain this. I feel like I am the steward of this publication that has been in existence since 1993, since I was 7 years old. I want it to continue to exist for another 30 years. How do I make sure that happens? And that is this is an industry that is in very, very, very precarious circumstance. And so that is something that I would love to say I spend 100% of my time working on journalism. I probably spend 45% of my time working on journalism because I spend the rest of my time making sure that we're making money. And I don't want the journalists who work for me to be worried about that. It breaks my heart to think that they might be worried about that. I want them to be worried about the election. I want them to be worried about the stories that they are trying to get onto the page.
Absolutely. What are you experimenting with in terms of revenue, and how are you innovating in that space? Like you mentioned, you guys all obviously heard the news about the thousands of layoffs at Bell Media, so this is impacting everyone worldwide. So how are you kind of maintaining or staying at the cutting edge of that?
Yeah, I mean, I wish that there was a silver bullet for any organization. I do. I think that, this isn't innovative, but I do think, I read a piece a few weeks ago that said something to the effect of, like, we need more leaders in journalism who are focused on the business. And I sort of read that and was like, yes, me, that's me. We, like, not that we need more people like me, but I think, I do a very different version of this job than an editor at Condé Nast 15 years ago. So I think even just that sort of leaders in this industry who are not only thinking about the news and the journalism, but who are thinking about the bottom line, I think that's one big piece of it. Yeah. And then I think for an outlet like Wired, there are so many different ways that we can make money. And so my point of view is we should not have one way. I think that was, for Vice, a real challenge, because that was a company that was 90-some% reliant on advertising revenue. And so as soon as that went away, it was game over. Like there were real problems. So for Wired, it's really about half of our business is advertising, and it's about sustaining that business and making sure that that business is healthy. Yep. And then we are building, a consumer revenue business, which is a fancy way of saying subscriptions, asking people to pay for our journalism, which I would ask all of you to pick a few outlets that you feel strongly about and support them, because it really does add up cumulatively, and it really does make a difference. So we are building a subscription business for Wired, and sort of really thinking about what are the different tiers of that, right? Like someone might pay $5 a month just to read our website and read the magazine, but they might pay $10 a month because they love our product coverage. They want more access to that, right? They want to feel a sense of community around that. That's one place where we're really experimenting is, bringing back the idea of forums, bringing back the idea of people commenting on articles and sort of interacting with Wired journalists in that capacity. A lot of people will pay to spend time with Stephen Levy, with Lauren Good, who are some of our sort of most prominent consumer technology journalists. We're asking people to pay to spend that time. Yep. And I think there's sort of a lot that you can do once you kind of unlock that. And then our commerce business, right? So we have some of the best product coverage, I think, in the industry. We take it very, very, very seriously. And that is a source of revenue for us. If you read a review of a new phone on Wired's website and you decide to buy the phone, we monetize that. Like, that is part of how we make money. But, I think there is this layer sort of to what we are doing and how we're thinking about our business going forward that really is driven by community, right? It's about finding those loyalists, finding those people who love Wired, who want more of Wired, and then, giving them opportunities to spend time with us, whether it's in-person events, whether it's, digital kind of live stream events where they can, ask our journalists about their most recent cover story, whether it's forums, whether it's, the chance to write your own product reviews on our website and sort of share your point of view on a product that we also reviewed. I think there's like a lot there that you can play with and test out and try. And I will say, like, I feel very lucky to work at a company where we have the runway to try these things, right? We have the infrastructure, we have the support. That's something that at other media organizations I've worked at, and I wish I could go to Ben Smith's talk in a month or whenever it is, because his book is all about this, sort of this race for scale in digital media and the reliance on advertising that was built up through that process. And then as soon as the bottom falls out, right, as soon as Facebook and Twitter decide that they're not going to promote your news stories, all of a sudden no one's clicking on your website. If they're not clicking on your website, they're not seeing your ads. All of a sudden, you don't have a business. Yeah. So it's really about sort of trying to untether ourselves from that reliance, right, which was, I think, a real misdirection for the industry.
You were talking about consumer revenue, and you have a plethora of consumers around the world. So Wired has a presence in the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Italy, Japan, Korea, Mexico, Latin America, the Middle East, the UK, and of course the US. So your international reach means that you have to deal with the varied ways that tech is perceived and adopted across cultures, which I find fascinating because these markets are like wildly different from each other. So how are you ensuring that Wired's journalism resonates across these different landscapes, both editorially, but also from a consumer revenue business standpoint?
Yeah, it's something I feel really strongly about. And I think one of the reasons I feel strongly about it is because I grew up in Canada, very proudly, and I was a consumer of a lot of American news, right? It was, Tom Brokaw was on TV every night. it was a lot of America, a lot of America, a lot of America. So when I moved to the United States and became a journalist and got into management, it was very clear to me that, and I say this with love because I've lived in the United States for a long time, but American journalists really tend to spend a lot of time thinking about the United States. And there's a real sort of like a self-involvement where it's like, oh, it's the United, and it's like, no, actually, have you ever heard of these other countries all around the world where all of this really interesting stuff is happening? And at Wired, you know, we haven't done enough with the fact that we have a team in Tokyo, we have a team in Milan, we have a team in London, you know, we have a team in Mexico, and they are covering technology and innovation in those parts of the world. And I am much more interested in figuring out how we collaborate with those teams, translate their work, bring that work to an English language audience, instead of sort of constantly like pushing our journalism out into these other parts of the world and just expecting those audiences to think that that's great. I think it's sort of much more beneficial for us to introduce innovation and technology and sort of what's interesting and important and relevant and vital that's happening in these other places to an English language audience. And I want that work to be created by the journalists who live and work in those parts of the world. So I think we are just like starting to unlock that. Like we have just started to work translating stories from our team in Mexico, and they're fantastic. And the audience, you know, our American audience is reading them, which is a really positive signal. But I think, you know, as far as a business consideration goes, you know, that's a really important differentiator for Wired. There are a lot of other like tech outlets, very few of them can say that they operate in that many countries. And I think to not sort of use that to our advantage editorially and as storytellers would be a huge mistake, right? Because that advantage then translates to, you know, a healthier and more sustainable business, because we are able to say, no, we are worth paying for, we are worth paying attention to, because we do something different. Like we are a global brand in a way that so many other technology outlets, not that they're bad outlets, they're great, they do fantastic work, they just don't have that reach.
Yeah, absolutely. And a global audience or global reach really entails, you know, we live in a pluralistic, diverse society, and there's diaspora communities that represent all nationalities in the US and Canada, so I'm sure there's an audience for even that kind of coverage.
Absolutely,
at Wired. So this is the point in our conversation where I inevitably bring up artificial intelligence.
Great.
Because who's talking about AI these days, you guys? So I'm really curious, how will Wired cover specifically generative AI's impact on society in a way that informs without resorting to alarmism or sensationalism? Because you see this binary conversation emerging about AI where it's like, it's the heralding of a new, you know, era in technology, and it's just kind of breathless optimism, especially in business sectors, but then also at the same time you have, you know, this really fear-based resistance, including in our own industry as well, right? So I'd love to hear how you guys are approaching that topic.
Yeah, I will say it's very interesting to work in an industry that feels an existential threat from this technology and then be trying to cover it. I mean, I work for a parent company that is like any media company, right? Like the New York Times is suing OpenAI right now. My own parent company is in conversations with these generative AI companies about how they are using our data, how they're using our archives and all of the work to train these large language models. So there's something very meta about it, but I agree with you that I think a lot of the coverage is breathless, it's hypothetical, it's lost in the clouds. It is either we'll all be dead in 10 years and there will be a robot standing over your body laughing, or we're all going to be working 4-day weeks and it's going to be so chill and you have never had a better time than when you let this AI take over your job and do all your work for you. The reality is actually it's you know, in practical terms, for a typical white-collar worker, it's like having a smart college-age intern helping out. Like, and they make a lot of mistakes and hallucinate every once in a while. Like, that's where we are, just to be clear. Like, this is not, we're not talking like RoboCop, like crazy future world. So that's how we're covering it, right? Which is trying to be very grounded in the here and the now, always with an eye to the future, but I think you start to lose people, you start to lose audiences when you're just esoteric up here in the clouds. Like, no, how does it work? When it evolves, right? When like new iterations of these technologies come out, being really clear about, what are the kind of step changes that have happened from like Llama 2 to Llama 3, that's Facebook's Gen AI model, like really being practical and clear with audiences and really trying to put a human lens on these stories, right? Like trying to tell the stories about how is this technology changing people's jobs in this industry, in that industry? What is it doing that is maybe like really interesting and exciting over here with, say, radiology or modern medicine? What is it doing over here in this call center that might be a little bit problematic? Like maybe we actually should not have replaced all of these human phone operators with AI chatbots because we just like caused a real problem at this eating disorder resource center, which was a story that we did recently. So really being very like brass tacks and in the here and now and human about the coverage. And I think too, like I am a real believer in and advocate for, accountability driven journalism. Like that is what we do. Like that is what I get up in the morning to do. Yep. And again, I think coming back to Wired's mission of, being in service of a better future, right? Like that is always what I come back to. There's a real accountability piece when you are looking at these companies that are, rushing forward with this technology, they are in a very sort of like capitalist race to see who can be first, who can be best, who can monetize, who can be number one. And there's not a lot of discussion or consideration about regulation, about safeguards, about how this might actually affect, the labor market. How might this affect people's jobs? How will this affect education? How is this going to affect the lives of our children? Like those conversations are notably absent, when you hear from Sam Altman or when you hear from, Satya Nadella or when you hear from Mark Zuckerberg, like they're not talking about that. They're talking about how much better their model is than the other guy's model. And so I think part of our job is to look really critically at these companies, at what they're doing, what they're not doing, what they're saying versus what they're doing. They will all say, we welcome regulation. We look forward to working with policymakers, while they go rush out, the next version of their large language model because these other guys just rushed out their version, so they got to rush out their version. It's like, doesn't end well. We have seen this before. We have seen what happens when technology outpaces regulation and when kind of no one is really paying attention and all of a sudden, Facebook has taken over the entire media industry and they can turn the lights out with the flick of a switch. And so I think that is like fundamentally our job. We can be really excited about this technology. We can think from a technical point of view that it's incredible. And we do think that. Our journalists do think that. They're very excited about generative AI. We want to be using it in the newsroom in certain respects. But I think we owe it to the audience to be very, very clear-eyed about what these companies are doing as opposed to what they're saying.
Yeah, you raise up a good point about how we've gone through this before with social media, and in fact, both you and I have been in the technology media sector for some time. I used to work at Mashable, and there was a lot of breathless optimism about social in the late aughts, mid 2000s to late 2000s. So, what kind of lessons did you learn in your tenure from that experience, and how are you bringing that to your coverage of AI?
Yeah, I mean, don't take the money, I think is a good lesson. I think there are a lot of really cautionary tales to be told about that era. I think thinking sort of from a self-interested sort of insular media point of view, I come back obsessively. I work with someone who's fantastic and he worked at BuzzFeed. And I always say, like, remember the time that Facebook gave all of these media companies a bunch of money to do live video on Facebook, and it was going to be called Facebook Live, and it was going to reach just hundreds of millions of people. And then BuzzFeed, like everyone was like doing the lowest common denominator video coverage that they possibly could to try to get the biggest possible audience. And there was this like infamous clip where BuzzFeed took a watermelon and they put elastic bands around the watermelon. And it was like, how many elastic bands can we put around this watermelon until the watermelon explodes? It was like this seminal moment in digital media. And I say to him, like, don't you think about the watermelon all the time? And he's like, no, I don't. I'm like, I do. And then, of course, Facebook, misled media companies about how widely viewed these videos were, pulled the funding, everybody got laid off. No more watermelons for anybody. And like, these are hundreds of thousands of dollars or millions of dollars going to these companies. And so I think, one of the biggest cautionary tales for me and lessons for me in that, just coming back to kind of our discussion about business, was if a platform offers you audience and money, tread very carefully
Yeah.
because you never know when that plug is going to get pulled. It's incredible to think about Facebook's sort of stated commitment to news 10 years ago to now. I mean, our traffic at Wired from social media has gone from something like 65% to 7%. That is a lot of audience to have to make up as a media company. So I think, that's the biggest cautionary tale, is that, if there is journalism happening on a platform that you don't own, that you can't control, be very, very careful about how you invest in that platform. I want to reach those audiences. I want to reach the audience on TikTok. I want them to know and love Wired journalists and our journalism, but we can't give away the whole show.
Yeah.
We just can't. We can't control what TikTok does and does not decide to do, or what the federal government does and does not decide to do with that platform.
Yep. So pivoting from coverage of AI to usage of AI in the newsroom, so we've seen, like I mentioned, how major tech shifts often disrupt legacy processes and practices. But AI in particular is seen as particularly disruptive and revolutionary in the sense that some people are comparing it to the internet. It's the second coming. And throughout your career, you've had a history of leading multiple newsrooms through major transitions. So at Wired, how are you integrating these new technologies like AI in a way that enhances rather than undermines Wired's journalistic integrity, originality, and quality? You alluded to it a bit.
Yeah,
but
very, very carefully, in large part because, and I think we've seen it, right? There have been, there was the CNET, Sports Illustrated, there were some major outlets that, as generative AI was sort of booming and becoming this real phenomenon, that they started using generative AI to write articles, and then they published the articles, and the articles contained a bunch of errors and had to be retracted or had to be sort of pulled down.
Yep.
Nobody wants that. That is not, journalism is a human endeavor at the end of the day. I mean, you need reporters to be making phone calls, you need them going out into the world, you need them, writing their own stories. It is a creative process. It is a fact-driven process. These tools are nowhere near being ready to sort of produce content at scale or to replace a human journalist. I don't think they ever will be. And we, and sort of, I can't speak for my parent company, although I will say they are treading very, very carefully, and I think they are being very conservative, and I think that they are smart to do so for everything that we just talked about in terms of these cautionary tales about where technology and media collide and where that has gone wrong in the past. So I would say, on Wired's end, I think everyone is really eager to play with these tools more and learn to use them more. I think the first step for us has really been around education, right? We might have some journalists who, they're as a hobby, building their own chatbots, right? They're really, really in it, and they understand it intuitively. It makes sense to them. Maybe it's their beat. Maybe they cover it. And then we might have other journalists who cover science or pop culture and they're not familiar in the way they need to be to really be conversant with what these tools can and cannot do. So part of it for us has really been about training the newsroom and sort of newsroom education, encouraging people to experiment with these tools, try them on their own. Someone gave me really good advice about a year ago, which was just spend 20 minutes a day talking to ChatGPT. Just chat with it, just talk to it and see what comes of that. You will start to understand what these things are capable of, but you have to spend the time. And so that's something I've really tried to pass on. And then I think, we do a lot of investigative reporting at Wired, and it's something that I want us to do more and more of. It's a real focus area for me. So we have started using generative AI tools in the background to, summarize information for us, or we might do freedom of information requests where you get 1 million different documents from every state across the country, and you need a way to sort of summarize and collate those and pull out relevant information. So we're using tools for that purpose. I was saying, a college student, a research assistant is really how we think about what they're able to do for us now. But I would again say, always with a human layer, always with someone looking at the work, vetting the work, making sure that what these tools are producing is accurate, because accuracy continues to be a real problem. And we are not in the business of publishing inaccurate information, especially not this year, but ever, but especially not this year.
Have you tried applying AI to business development initiatives at all? For myself, like I run an independent media startup, and I was able to access a $50,000 grant by leveraging AI, something that would have taken me 40 hours to do. It took me 4 hours. So that was really beneficial. Have you leveraged it on the business side at all?
Well, I will now. No.
Okay, something
I love
on
it.
your to-do list.
Yeah.
That's great. So we talked a lot about technology, and you talked about it sounds like Wired is very human-centered technology publication. So what other kind of human-centered initiatives are you embarking on? Like, how are you really prioritizing that within just your editorial strategy? Because events, as you mentioned before, in your history of work, that you've actually been able to monetize events, for example, and that's becoming a really popular revenue stream for a lot of publications. So how are you approaching that?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. There are a lot of different ways I could answer it. I mean, I think when you talk about Wired and you talk about humans and humanizing it, I think what it brings to mind for me is, when I started, Wired felt like a very anonymous brand. Like you would think about Wired and you might think about Autocomplete, right, which is our very popular YouTube show where celebrities answer questions from Google, and you're like, I don't see much Wired in that. Or you read the website, you see bylines, but it was very much like, well, who is Wired? Like, who are the people behind Wired? And I think that one of my big priorities, and one thing that actually these platforms that we're talking about, like TikTok, right, like vertical video platforms or Instagram, one of the things they're really good at is, very low cost, very efficient video. And for me, that's a really important and powerful tool to actually introduce audiences to our journalists, right? It's very hard to do that with a byline. You see the name, but you're probably just scanning the article. You're not thinking about the person behind it. So I think I am like literally trying to humanize the brand by putting the faces of Wired out in front more often, right? So when we talk about, any given story that someone might write, we're then going to do a version of that on vertical video where they're going to talk the audience through the story. And I think just going back to the idea even of in politics and sort of influencers and trust and people being more likely to trust a person than a news organization or an institution, I think that for us is a really effective way to kind of break through that paradigm, right? And that sort of new standard or that new norm is to actually just put the journalist in front of the audience and have them have sort of like an unmediated interaction where you can get to know someone, right? Like if you follow Wired on TikTok over time, you'll say, oh, Lauren Good, like I love her coverage, she's so smart, she's awesome. Wired, Lauren Good, Wired, and you start to associate like the people with the title, which I think is something that wasn't happening before, and that's not a knock on Wired. I think that's just like a relatively new phenomenon in the industry, that we have this technology and we have these tools to actually like put the people in front of the journalism more effectively. So I'm very focused on that, and the newsroom is really, really excited about that. Like we've been having a lot of fun with, experimenting with different ways of sort of putting the person out front for the audience to spend time with. And then again, when we're talking about business models, you see Lauren Good, you follow her, you really like her, you get to know her, you then, yes, you want to watch her on a live stream talking about her latest cover story. Yes, you want to ask her questions in the forums, in the Wired forums. Like, you want to start spending time with these people because they become sort of part of your digital milieu that you are, that you exist in, right? That we all exist in. That's where we spend most of our time.
You mentioned earlier that Wired has somewhat of a mission orientation, like obviously responsible journalism, covering tech for the social good to a large degree. So it behooves me, because this talk is presented as part of Democracy Exchange, to talk about the critical role of journalism in shaping civic discourse. So how does Wired's editorial strategy contribute to a more informed and engaged civil society? Like, how are you actively working towards that?
Oh, that's a really good question. I mean, it's not that I don't want to be civil, because I do. There is something to be said, I think, in the country where I work at the moment in time where I work, where I am working, when I am working there. We are very civil. Like, we present the facts, we present the information, we tell the stories. We work really, really hard to get our stories in front of as many people in as many different formats as we can, right? Print magazine, website, vertical video, YouTube video, podcasts, newsletters. We're thoughtful, we're respectful. Again, we are sort of fact and information led. what the audience then chooses to do with that information is up to them. And I think there's only so much we can do at that point, sort of once the information has left us. Whether that discourse will be civil or not in the United States at this moment in time is an open question. But the best and most important thing we can do is sort of value accuracy and fair reporting above all else, and then let the audience sort of make that determination. I wish I had sort of a perfect answer for that.
Yeah.
It's hard to overstate what a fractured environment we exist in right now.
Absolutely.
And how difficult it is to reach, every side of a debate or every side of a conversation. So all we can do is put the information out into the world and do everything we can to get it in front of as many people as we possibly can. We're very committed to that.
And that's a perfect segue to my final question before we go to audience questions. So you mentioned we live in a really complex and fractured information ecosystem. So what advice can you offer the audience here today when it comes to critically evaluating sources, discerning quality journalism from mis and disinformation, and then staying informed without feeling overwhelmed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Another good question. Don't spend all day on your phone. I think that's a good place to start. I mean, look, like what I said at the beginning, everyone is in a different position in terms of what they are able and willing to pay for, right? If you can pay for one news source, if you can pay for 3, if you can pay for 10, whatever your finances allow, whatever your appetite is, pay for the journalism that you want to read. I can't say that enough. And, to some extent, like, be your own advocate, because nobody is going to be that sort of information cop for you. Nobody is going to be that information advocate for you. Fact check the journalism that you read. If you read it in one place, go get a second opinion. There are lots of them out there, still many media organizations that exist. Read 2 versions of the same news event, right? Don't limit yourself to like one source. I would really strongly suggest sort of reading a few different outlets. For me, like, I read the New York Times, I read it every day. I probably read a dozen other news organizations, often the same news event told in different ways, and you sort of start to identify like patterns or trends or ways that different news organizations cover the same story. And that, I think, is sort of it's a way to sort of start to teach yourself, right? Like it's a mechanism that it's a muscle that you can build, right? If you can sort of develop that information literacy and build on that. I think that's a really powerful thing, because the internet is a wide open space. Like, you can find pretty much anything out there if you look. So I think it's really important to look with caution and to look in a few places, find places that you trust and that you feel that you can rely on, and then pay for them, pay for those places.
I co-sign that heartily.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for a fascinating and awesome
Thank
conversation,
you.
Katie.
That was very fast.
Round of applause. It did go by really quickly.